Hi everybody, I'm Angela Fehr. Today we're going to have some fun painting an abstract floral, and we're going to talk about the two words light and quick and how they connect with watercolor painting. I really think that good observation and using a light touch can really be key to making your paintings more creative and expressive, and I'm going to show you that today. Let's start with a little of what not to do. And one thing that I want to demonstrate is that I have my palettes here full of all different colors of pigment. And some of these pigments really activate quickly. When I mist them with water, which is how I start every painting session, they really start a nice little puddle of pigment on the surface of that paint well. But when some colors are a little drier and you have to spend a little more time massaging them to get a rich saturation of color out. And this is something you should pay attention to, because when you see an artist who paints with a rich, vibrant saturation of color and you're feeling like your paint goes on pale and watery, it's very likely that you're just not getting that activation on your palette, and you need to spend a little more time moistening your paint, working with fresh pigment in the case of some pigments that dry really hard and crunchy and really firm in your palette. Or even just spending a little time with a damp brush, kind of stroking and massaging that paint to get some of that dried pigment loosened up so you can paint on it. And that's just a quick tip before we actually start painting. But when you're working with that pigment and you're getting a bunch of it on your brush and then you want it to flow on your paper, of course it's not going to do much. That's Mayan blue from Daniel Smith. It's not going to do much when you paint on dry paper. You're not going to get a lot of flow. And if I paint that color, the Mayan blue, and then put another color beside it, let's pick this Cascade green over here, and I'll put them side by side, and they will blend a little bit. The Cascade blue green wants to push into the Mayan blue just a bit on this edge, but you don't see a lot of movement because of course the paper's not very wet. If I have wet paper, and just moisten it here with my brush. And a lot of times what a beginning painter will do is they'll moisten their paper with their brush, and they won't, as I haven't gone back to my water container, they just keep spreading that water out and pulling it across the page. And what happens is I've only got one brush load of water on this paper. That's not going to fill the whole page with a lot of moisture to spare. So as soon as I think it's full and I put my color down, it does start to flow a little bit because the paper is wet. But I'm not going to get, I can't tilt my board or my paper and see it flow downwards. So I'm not getting that fluidity. And so I love to moisten everything so that it's really juicy on top. There is a sheen of water that's sitting on that surface, and then putting my paint down, going back to those same two colors and tilting this paper, and now you can see I'm getting that flow that I talked about. And the two different paints have very different properties, and so one color might flow in a kind of granular, chunky way, and one might flow more smoothly, and that's where you get some really beautiful contrasts. But how much water is on your paper to begin with is really going to affect how that paint moves. This one here in the middle, now that I've added water from here, it's moist enough that it is flowing now, whereas it didn't really have much movement before. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking for the flow that I get as a professional watercolor artist. It's using a lot more water to get that movement. And the other thing I really try to remember, and this is where we're going to actually get down to our main event, is that there is a huge amount of power in restraint. And I'm just going to mist my paper, and I was working with Brusho crystals earlier, so you can see actually a little bit of those crystals must have been floating in the air or gotten on this paper, because I can see just a little bit of a sprinkling of color. And that's just a reminder to me to keep my studio cleaner. And I'm going to do a wet and wet beginning here to my painting. And a lot of times when I take a beginner student and encourage them to do something loose and fluid, they will just absolutely fill their entire page with color. And it's really easy to feel like you're not being productive as a painter, and if you're not putting a lot of paint on your paper. This is Moonglow. It's a beautiful kind of muddy purple. And I want you to notice how lightly I'm touching the brush to the paper. It is just very lightly dotting in, and then I'm letting that fluidity do its job. It doesn't have to be the tip of your brush. Whoops. You can use the side of your brush to dot in some color. But I'm not telling it where to go with my brush. I'm not pulling it across the paper. What I could do is, if I want it to flow in one direction, I might tilt. But I'm not filling my brush with color and then rubbing it onto the paper. Moonglow, as it starts to dry and starts to move, you can see there's a little bit of blue in there, blue pigment that starts to come out. So it separates and granulates, so you get some really beautiful different color effects. I'm just going to add a little bit more over here. And so I'm not feeling like I need to fill my whole paper with color. And I just added a little bit more color than I need over on this side. I'm going to add a little bit of water to channel it away. Just float it down to another area of my paper. And that left that space open. But what has not happened is I have not felt the need to fill my whole paper. We're holding back. With watercolor, often you want to paint less and look more. And whenever you're painting in watercolor, because your paper is your white, every time you put your brush on your paper, you're removing white from the paper. And so I'm going to grab the Mayan blue again. I think it'll pair really nicely with the hint of blue that's in our shadow, our Moonglow. And I'm going to just sprinkle it on the damp brush. And again, not feeling the need, I'm leaving the white areas white. I don't want to lose all my light colors just because I feel the need to be busy. And I think we think that the more brush strokes we use, the better an artist we are, and that's very often not the case. A good artist is going to spend more time looking and observing and deciding what direction they want their painting to go before they ever put their brush on the paper. And for me, as a painter who's very intuitive, I don't plan everything I'm going to do because I want to react and respond to what's happening on the paper. But that does still mean I need to spend a lot of time looking at what my painting might need. Now I'm very aware right now that I'm painting wet and wet, and that means when my paint goes on the paper, I know everything's going to have a soft edge, everything's going to bleed. And so when I am aware of that, it helps me to stay loose and not to try to put details in that are going to kind of bleed and soften away anyhow. I want some color to move, but I think I want to push it with some water so I can use my clean damp brush, dot into my paper, and get a little bit of movement going just by adding water to my paper. And I'm tilting again and just keeping a very light touch. I'm going to go right back to my Moonglow, and as this color has sat moist in my palette, it's getting, the paint in that well is getting softer. And so as my painting session continues, the paint that I sprayed and activated originally is becoming even more soft and easy to pick up a strong saturation of color. And as when you're painting wet and wet, things tend to lighten as they spread, and as they begin to dry, the color flows outward, so you lose some of that dark saturation. So if I want a dark color, sometimes I have to build that up by adding a little bit more as the painting progresses. And right now I can add those darks and they will stay soft and fluid. If I wait for things to dry, then I'll have some crisper lines in the next phase. So I'm going to stop. And what I want you to observe is this whole less is more idea. Light touches with my brush. Only two colors. I used Moonglow and the Mayan blue. I'm aware when I use Moonglow that because it's made up of several different pigments, it does this thing where it looks like more than one color, which I think is really beautiful. And because I'm just using those two colors, I have a lot more freedom as this painting progresses to decide if I want to add a third color in my next stage, or if I want to continue to work with this very soft and limited palette. When I'm working wet and wet, I can also decide if I want to add more to my painting. If I want to take my salt, for example, and sprinkle some of that to add some texture, and I might just add a little tiny bit, like I said, a tiny bit, over in this corner. And this is a very light area, so any salt that I add here will probably give a very subtle effect. And I find when you're using texture tools like salt, that it is better, I like better to have the texture appear without it screaming out, hey, over here is some salt. Often you'll go to a gallery and you'll see a watercolor. Sometimes you'll see a watercolor painting and you'll go, oh look, that artist used salt, the salt technique to make texture. I don't want my painting to talk about the techniques used to make it. I want it to just speak of the beauty of watercolor, you know, the theme or the mood that I was trying to project. So when I add salt, I work very hard to keep it subtle. What I think is lovely about painting with a light touch is just having that time to build a painting. When you're in a rush and you throw a lot of paint on without that deliberation, when you scrub colors around, these are things that kind of force us in a direction we might not be ready to go. So taking that time, studying what needs to happen on your painting, just pausing to look and reflect, and leave some spaces light and unspoken. That gives us room to move, to let our painting progress in a really natural way. What I want to do now is just find some shapes, and I don't have any greens in here, but I'm thinking floral anyhow. So I'm going to just start pulling out some floral shapes, and what I'm imagining is maybe a kind of a wand-shaped floral along here, so something like larkspur, maybe. And I'm adding water right now. This water will serve to soften the edges of these brush marks, and it'll also push into the wash I've just placed and push some of that color around. So it gives us movement and softness. And the transparency of the paint means I'm getting layers of color happening. I'm going to start introducing a new color. I'm going to go with the Sleeping Beauty Turquoise. So it's a new color, but it's connected because it has, it's a blue. It's a blue that harmonizes well with the Mayan blue. And it also has a real softness to it that I wouldn't get if I was painting with maybe phthalo turquoise. I'm going to pick out a stem here just by painting negatively, painting around what I've already laid down. And my goal when I'm starting to add those further details is I'm going to have some line work, but I'm also going to keep, I'm not changing what I've already done. So I'm keeping the softness. I'm not going immediately to crisp details. I can continue to be soft and flowing. Lots of liquid there to let that color flow, but a more defined area in which it's going to flow. It's not going to flow into the parts of the painting that are dry. And so my changes are going to be gradual. If I'm starting to add details, I'm also going to balance those to temper them with softness. If I'm going to change the colors, I'm going to change them, add new colors that are connected and related to the colors I'm placing, have already placed in the painting. I like this little shape right here. Looks like a piece of a flower. Up here, the salt has created all these beautiful little fingers and texture, and I didn't actually brush the salt off. Most of it's dissolved, still a little bit there. So I kind of want to work with that, and the pinkiness in there comes from the Moonglow, which is actually a purple, but as it dried, you know, you can kind of see the kind of a bit of a rose. So I'm going to try a different pink. I think it's Rhodonite, and it's a little bit of a violet. Not quite as pink as it could be, but over here, those little fingers to me look like a chrysanthemum. So I'm going to paint around them in that shape that you might expect to see in a chrysanthemum, a little bit of those zigzag round petals. This one maybe isn't really following the shape too much. And I'm going to keep it light, not wanting to build up those darks right away. This pink, the Rhodonite, it is a little bit too bright, but touching in a little bit of Moonglow will give me that unity I need with what's already on the painting. And just because I'm painting that outer edge of the flower shape, I actually go inside of the flower a little bit as well, because that gives me, again, that softness. It fits everything together. It's not just about this one flower in the corner, it's about how everything combines. And we need a little bit of additional color in there. Let's add some of that turquoise. I'm not sure that shape is going to resolve well. I don't know if it's really going to look like a chrysanthemum, but I don't need it to be a perfect chrysanthemum because it doesn't have to stay a chrysanthemum. If someone sees a different shape of flower in there, that's okay too. I really just don't want, I want to have that feeling of flowers, of a cluster of objects. And exactly what they are doesn't have to be completely spelled out. Right here I'm creating, I've been negative painting, I've been painting around shapes to define the shape that was to define the wash that was painted earlier. Here I'm painting the shape itself. This looks like the edge of another of those wand-shaped flowers over here. So it gives me kind of it's a give and take, I think. There's this back and forth feeling when you do that. Now maybe we should, oh, that's kind of nice. Paint some central with, if this is a chrysanthemum or a dahlia or something along those lines, it's going to have smaller petals closely clustered in the center. And I can suggest that with just these little marks here, touching in maybe a little Moonglow. And the Moonglow goes in quite dark, but I'll show you how to lighten it in a second. Letting it flow. I'm going to blot my brush so it's got that absorbency like a sponge, And then I can touch it in over here and lift out areas where the color's gone in too dark, or there's a bubble of paint that will take a long time to dry. You can blot your brush and even just kind of roll it, and that softens an edge. And because I was touching those colors in so delicately, you know, they're just swimming on that moist surface. So my paint is going on so much in whispers, you know, there's so many soft shapes, and whispering is a good way to describe it. You know, just putting on those really juicy little touches of color. Some of them are so delicate. And then when you get toward, once you get those whispered details in, then you might think of taking a large quantity of paint. I'll grab some Moonglow. And with that stronger saturation, you know, maybe you put in a bold line here and there. And of course it's moist over here, so everything's going to flow a bit still. And maybe something over here to balance it out. More of that positive painting, painting the shape, the outer edge, letting it flow this way. Now in this painting I look for unity over here. This seems a little bit too different from everything else, and I don't think different is necessarily bad. You want variety, you don't want a sameness, but I almost think if I just go in with a little bit of water and touch some of these elements together, I think it'll have that softer flow that kind of fits with the rest of the painting. And let's go in with a little bit more of that, those petal shapes on this side as well. Maybe a petal, pointy petal here, maybe a little one here. You don't have to paint like here. This is a dahlia or chrysanthemum circular flower. You do not need to paint the entire circle. In fact, I think it's usually better if you don't. Here I have now a semicircle, and I don't really have to continue it. Our brain wants to complete this circuit even if we don't paint the entire circle. I like a little bit of spatter, and that will actually kind of echo what's happening in this center of this flower. So there you have it, a little look at the power of a light touch and letting the colors just flow on the paper, on responding to what's happening on your painting and giving it room to develop. And I can't promise you that I'm not going to continue on this painting, adding finishing touches that end up ruining the whole thing. It sometimes happens that way, and I have to remind myself that if I'm not willing to take risks, and a risk that could ruin my painting, I'm going to stay in a safe place. I'm not going to challenge myself, and I'm probably not going to learn as quickly as when I'm willing to just take a risk, make a mistake, and ask myself what if, and then chase that idea. So whether or not that means this painting is going to turn out, I know that I'm going to have fun continuing to kind of analyze it and decide whether it needs any further details, what those details should be, and then try to get it done in a way that makes me happy and feel like the painting is a success. If you liked this video and found it useful, you might enjoy my online watercolor course, Painting Lovely Loose Florals in Watercolor. It's more of a realistic approach to painting flowers, but also with that idea of really wanting to capture your own personal style and get that down on paper. Not about perfect botanical realism, and there's some wonderful instructors who teach that style. But for me, I want to evoke a feeling, and I want this free expression that I don't get when I'm sketching every painstaking petal in detail. Check out my courses on my website, learn.angelafehr.com. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube. I share live video lessons on a weekly basis, and we always have a ton of watercolor fun. I'm Angela Fehr. Thanks for watching.